December 7, 1941, did not begin like the first day of a war. It began like thousands of other mornings that had passed unnoticed across the Pacific, with the sun rising gently over Pearl Harbor and turning the still water into polished metal. The air was warm but forgiving, heavy with salt and oil, the kind of morning that lulled men into believing the world was stable, predictable, and ultimately safe. Battleships sat quietly at anchor, enormous and confident, their decks already warming beneath the sun. Sailors laughed, complained, drank coffee, and talked about nothing important, unaware that time itself was about to fracture. Marine Gunnery Sergeant Tom Brewster walked across the base with the steady, economical stride of a man who had survived too long to believe in coincidence. 20 years in uniform had taught him that calm was often just a pause between disasters, but even he could not have predicted how suddenly the sky would turn hostile. At 7:55 a.m., the illusion ended. The first explosions did not sound like bombs at first. They sounded like the world tearing itself apart. Shockwaves rolled across the harbor, slamming into buildings and bodies alike, rattling bones and shattering glass. Brewster felt the concussion before he registered the sound, a pressure that punched the air from his lungs and sent his heart racing. Then came the engines, dozens of them, screaming out of the western sky in tight formation. The noise drowned out everything else. Orders vanished. Alarms screamed without coordination. Smoke began to rise in thick black pillars as fuel ignited and ships burned where they lay. Men froze. Some ran. Some stared upward in disbelief. Brewster did neither. His instincts, honed by decades of training and repetition, took control before panic could reach him. He sprinted toward the armory as machine gun fire slashed across open ground, rounds cracking past with a sound like tearing cloth. Splinters jumped from walls. Shouts dissolved into chaos. Inside the armory, rifles were already being pulled from racks by shaking hands. Brewster grabbed a Springfield and moved with practiced precision, chambering around, tightening the sling, checking the balance. The rifle felt like an extension of his body, familiar and reliable in a world that had suddenly become unrecognizable. Mounted above the bolt was the same scope he had trusted for years, a 5-power optic designed in another era, when wars were fought at known distances and targets stood still long enough to be measured. Brewster had qualified expert with this rifle more times than he could remember. At Quantico, under clear skies and calm wind, he had placed round after round into the 10 ring at 600 yards. He knew the weapon. He trusted it. But Pearl Harbor was not a rifle range. Smoke drifted low and thick, oil burned on the water, and the air shimmered with heat and fear. From behind a burning warehouse, Brewster spotted movement over the harbor. A Japanese aircraft flew low and slow, banking casually as its machine gun spat fire into the oil-slicked water below. Sailors struggled amid wreckage, their white uniforms turning black as they fought not to drown. The pilot circled without urgency, confident that nothing on the ground could touch him. Brewster raised the rifle and peered through the scope. The aircraft appeared as a dark silhouette against a gray sky, its details lost in distance and smoke. 800 yards. Maybe more. Brewster dropped prone, elbows braced against concrete, breathing slowing as training took over. He calculated lead, compensated for wind carrying the stench of burning ships, and squeezed the trigger. The rifle cracked, sharp and precise, but the bullet passed harmlessly behind the aircraft. Brewster knew it instantly. He worked the bolt again, but the aircraft was already climbing, banking away toward altitude where rifles were useless. In that moment, as fires raged and men died within sight of safety, Brewster understood something that no manual had prepared him for. The enemy was fighting at distances Americans could not see clearly enough to reach. It was not a failure of courage or skill. It was a failure of vision. That realization did not end with Pearl Harbor. It followed the Marine Corps westward across the Pacific, carried island to island by casualty reports and bitter after-action summaries. On Wake Island, on Bataan, on Guadalcanal, Marines encountered Japanese snipers who understood terrain, patience, and optics with ruthless efficiency. Shots came from tree lines and ridges that seemed impossibly far away. Men fell without ever seeing who fired. American marksmanship was excellent, but excellence meant nothing if the shooter could not identify the target. Back in Washington, Captain George Van Orton read the reports with mounting frustration. He was not a man easily swayed by complaints. A competitive marksman with decades of experience, Van Orton believed deeply in training and discipline. But these reports told a different story. They described Marines doing everything right and still dying. The common thread was always distance. The enemy could see farther. Van Orton knew the limitations of existing equipment intimately. The standard scope had been adequate once, but the war had changed. Engagement distances stretched beyond 600 yards. Terrain favored concealment. Visibility mattered more than brute force. His journey to Pittsburgh that winter was driven by urgency more than optimism. In a modest optical shop tucked between immigrant storefronts, John Unertel worked long after dark, grinding lenses by hand and chasing perfection with the stubborn devotion of a craftsman who believed precision was not a luxury, but a responsibility. When Van Orton looked through Unertel's 8-power civilian target scope, the effect was immediate and unsettling. Distant objects snapped into focus with impossible clarity. Leaves became individual shapes. Shadows resolved into forms. It was like seeing the battlefield for the first time. Unertel himself was hesitant. He warned that the scope was not designed for war. It had external adjustments, delicate mechanisms, tolerances measured in thousandths of an inch. Military experts had already rejected it as too fragile, too complex, too refined. But Van Orton understood that the future rarely looked rugged at first glance. Testing followed, and the numbers were undeniable. Rifles equipped with a scope produced accuracy far beyond existing standards. Groups tightened. Distances expanded. On paper, it was revolutionary. But paper did not account for humidity, dust, recoil, and fear. Field trials exposed weaknesses almost immediately. Rain-soaked mechanisms. Adjustments seized. Mounts shifted under recoil. Experienced Marines shook their heads and muttered about unnecessary complexity. Reports returned to Washington blunt and unforgiving. Too fragile. Too maintenance-intensive. Not suited for sustained combat. Unertel refused to accept that verdict. He worked longer hours, redesigned components, sealed lenses, strengthened mounts. His wife brought him coffee at midnight, finding him hunched over a lathe, his accent thick with frustration and determination. His son was in uniform now. The war was no longer theoretical. Desperation pushed the program forward despite institutional doubt. Precision rifles originally built for competition were modified for combat. Their polished bolts were blued to prevent reflection. Triggers were tuned. Scopes were mounted with care. Marines trained not only to shoot, but to maintain, clean, and protect the delicate mechanisms. In dry conditions, the results were astonishing. Japanese forces accustomed to operating outside American range suddenly found themselves vulnerable. Confidence spread quietly, passed from sniper to sniper in low voices. Then came the jungle. Humidity clung to everything. Coral dust infiltrated every crevice. Scopes fogged at the worst moments. Adjustments froze. Mounts lost zero. In the middle of savage fighting, Marines watched their promised advantage vanish at the moment they needed it most. After-action reports turned brutal. By late 1944, the decision was made. The scopes were phased out. Reliability trumped reach. Simpler equipment returned to the field. For many Marines, it felt like surrendering something that had almost changed the war. The rifles were packed away, coated in grease, and forgotten. Until Korea. When war erupted again in 1950, the Marine Corps found itself desperately short of precision equipment. Old rifles were pulled from storage, including the same scopes once deemed unsuitable. This time, the environment was different. Korea's mountains were dry. The air was clear. Distances were vast. The scopes worked. Adjustments turned smoothly. Optics stayed clear. Zero held. Marines began making shots at distances once thought impossible. Enemy snipers fell without warning. Records were set. Confidence returned. A 1,200-yard kill near Seoul changed doctrine forever. The same equipment that failed in jungle humidity became legendary in mountain air. Years later, instructors would tell new Marines the lesson learned the hard way. Equipment must match environment. Innovation carries risk. And sometimes, the difference between failure and legacy is not design, but circumstance. The war that began with blind rifles over Pearl Harbor ended with a clearer understanding of distance, vision, and the price paid when soldiers can see the enemy, but not clearly enough to fight back.